Sweat pooled on the drafting table inside Fisherman's Bend, 1948, and one engineer refused to sign the release forms. Everyone outside that building believed the car rolling toward production was built entirely on Australian soil. He knew the truth sitting in his own hands. Blueprints stamped Detroit sat right beside drawings stamped Melbourne, and only one factory had actually done the inventing. Within weeks, the public would call it Australia's own car. Nobody would mention where the idea started. Before we get into it, type your state or country below. I want to see how far this story actually traveled. Detroit had already solved the problem before Melbourne even knew there was one. Inside General Motors' styling division, engineers spent 1944 through 1946 drawing a car meant for a market they'd never visited, guessing at roads they'd never driven, shaping a vehicle around assumptions instead of experience. War had just ended. Currency controls across the British Commonwealth made it nearly impossible for Australians to buy imported cars outright, and Canberra wanted local manufacturing badly enough to offer serious incentives to whichever company committed first. Lawrence Hartnett ran GM's Australian operations, and he saw the opening immediately. A country of 7 million people, starving for transportation, with almost no domestic car industry to speak of. That gap represented exactly the kind of foothold Detroit wanted in the Pacific. Hartnett pushed hard for approval, arguing that Australia could become the testing ground for a new kind of post-war strategy. Build local, badge local, let the public believe the whole thing started local. Detroit agreed, but only partway. Corporate leadership approved local assembly. They never approved local design. The car Australians would eventually call their own had already taken shape on drafting tables in Michigan, refined by American engineers working from American assumptions about weight, suspension, and road surfaces thousands of kilometers away from the conditions their car would actually face. That gap became obvious fast. Fisherman's Bend's engineering team received the finished blueprints in early 1946, expecting adjustments, maybe a few local tweaks to satisfy import regulations. Instead, they found a chassis tuned for smooth American highways, suspension components rated for conditions nothing like the corrugated dirt roads stretching across most of rural Australia. One senior engineer, reviewing the specs for the first time, reportedly told a colleague the car would shake itself apart outside city limits. Nobody in Detroit had driven those roads. Few in Detroit had even seen photographs of them. Distance bred assumption, and assumption bred a design flaw nobody back in Michigan could see from behind a desk 3,000 kilometers away. Local engineers faced an impossible choice: reject the blueprints outright and risk losing the entire manufacturing deal Hartnett had fought years to secure. Accept them as written and watch the car fail publicly within months of release, destroying the very trust the all-Australian marketing campaign was built to earn. Neither option protected the company or the country depending on this launch to succeed. So they chose a third path nobody in the boardroom had authorized. Quietly, without informing Detroit of the full scope, Fisherman's Bend's team began reworking the suspension geometry themselves, reinforcing mounting points, adjusting spring rates, testing prototypes on the roughest tracks they could find outside Melbourne. This wasn't sanctioned modification. It was survival engineering, done under deadline, done mostly without credit, done because the alternative meant public failure on a national scale. Every test run told the same story. Standard suspension components buckled within 100 kilometers on unsealed roads. Reinforced versions, hand-built and barely tested, held together mile after punishing mile. Engineers working late into winter nights in 1946 weren't just protecting a product launch. They were rewriting an American design to survive an environment its own creators had never imagined. None of this appeared in any press release. Marketing material heading toward printers in early 1948 described a car built by Australians for Australian conditions. Technically true by then, thanks entirely to work Detroit never requested and barely acknowledged. The blueprint said Detroit. The survival of that blueprint said Melbourne. One test still hadn't happened by the time production dates locked in. A final durability run, scheduled for the harshest stretch of Outback highway available, would determine whether those late-night suspension fixes actually held under real-world punishment, or whether the whole launch was about to collapse in front of the exact public it was designed to win over. That final durability run happened in March 1948 on a stretch of highway outside Alice Springs, chosen specifically because nothing about it forgave a weak design. Heat radiated off the dirt in visible waves. Two engineers rode in the test car itself, logging every rattle, every strain, every mile the reinforced suspension either survived or didn't. It survived. Barely, according to notes recovered decades later, but it survived. 3,000 kilometers of corrugated Outback road that would have destroyed the original American specification within the first 200. Relief inside the small testing team stayed subdued. Nobody celebrated loudly. They simply radioed confirmation back to Fisherman's Bend and started drafting the final production sign-off nobody had been certain they'd get to write. Launch day arrived in November 1948, and the public response exceeded even Hartnett's own projections. Crowds gathered outside dealerships in Melbourne and Sydney, eager to see a car the newspapers kept calling the first truly Australian automobile. Sales figures climbed immediately. Within 18 months, waiting lists stretched past a year in some regions. Families willing to save and wait simply to own something built, as far as they understood it, entirely by their own country. Here's what those buyers never learned. Their car's chassis, engine layout, and overall design had rolled off a Detroit drafting table years before a single Australian engineer touched it. What they actually owned was an American blueprint, kept alive on Australian roads by suspension work nobody at General Motors headquarters had requested, approved, or, for a long time, even fully understood had happened. Credit flowed exactly where marketing wanted it to flow. Advertisements praised Australian ingenuity, Australian materials, Australian pride, every word technically defensible, none of it explaining that the underlying design still belonged to engineers who'd never set foot south of the equator. The men who'd spent freezing 1946 nights rebuilding suspension components strong enough to survive Alice Springs received no public acknowledgement matching what they'd actually contributed. One of those engineers, interviewed decades later for an internal company retrospective, described watching the launch celebrations from the back of a crowd, unrecognized, unmentioned, holding knowledge that the car succeeding in front of him existed only because of work Detroit still didn't officially know about. Pride and frustration sat together in that memory, inseparable from each other even 50 years on. If uncovering the engineer's history left behind is exactly the kind of story you want more of, drop a subscribe now, because the next reveal in this one changes how you'll see every local car story afterward. Word of the suspension fix eventually reached Detroit, though not through any formal channel. American engineers reviewing shipped components for a routine quality audit in 1950 noticed reinforced mounting points that didn't match the original specification sheet at all. Confusion followed, then questions, then a slow dawning realization that Australia had rebuilt part of their own design without asking permission first. Reactions inside General Motors split sharply. Some executives treated it as a minor deviation, hardly worth escalating given how well the car was selling. Others saw something more significant, proof that a smaller, supposedly subordinate division had identified and solved an engineering flaw the parent company's own team had completely missed. That second interpretation would matter more than anyone in 1950 realized at the time, because buried inside those Australian test notes sat something Detroit's engineers hadn't considered at all, a suspension solution potentially useful far beyond one country's dirt roads. Reports started moving upward through GM's internal channels, slowly, unofficially, the kind of quiet technical memo that rarely makes headlines but occasionally reshapes an entire product line from the inside out. Detroit's engineers spent 1951 doing something almost unheard of for the era, studying a solution built by a division most of them considered junior at best. Internal test data from Fisherman's Bend's Outback runs got translated, reviewed, and eventually incorporated into broader suspension research across General Motors' global product lines. A fix built out of necessity on dirt roads outside Alice Springs was reshaping engineering conversations happening thousands of kilometers away in Michigan. Records from this period remain sparse, scattered across internal memos rather than public announcements, but the pattern is traceable. suspension components appearing in later GM export models, vehicles sold across parts of Africa, South America, and other regions with similarly punishing road conditions, bore design characteristics strikingly close to what Fisherman's Benz engineers had developed years earlier under deadline pressure nobody in Detroit had originally imposed with local conditions in mind. Think about what that actually represents. A car marketed as proof of American engineering superiority succeeded specifically because Australian engineers caught and corrected a flaw the original designers never anticipated. The relationship the public believed in, America teaching, Australia learning, had quietly reversed itself somewhere in the space between a drafting table and a dirt road nobody in Detroit had ever driven. Hartnett understood this dynamic better than almost anyone, and it frustrated him for years afterward. Interviews he gave later in life describe a persistent tension between what Australian engineers had actually accomplished and what Detroit's official history recorded. Corporate narratives credited American design vision. Hartnett's own private notes, uncovered decades after his death, credited something closer to Australian improvisation, saving an American mistake from public failure. Sales numbers, meanwhile, told their own story completely disconnected from any of this internal credit dispute. By the mid-1950s, the car had become the best-selling vehicle in Australian history, a genuine cultural fixture recognized in nearly every household across the country. Families photographed themselves beside it. Radio advertisements built entire jingles around its supposed local pride. None of that public affection required knowing where the blueprint actually originated. Why do most retrospectives skip this part entirely? Engineers who solved that suspension problem in 1946 never received patents, never received public credit, and in most cases, never received so much as a formal acknowledgement inside their own company's official records. Their work traveled the world, influencing vehicles sold on continents they'd never visited, while their names stayed confined to internal memos most executives never bothered reading twice. One engineer's daughter, interviewed for a regional heritage project decades later, described growing up without any real understanding of what her father had actually done during those winter nights in 1946. He rarely discussed it. Corporate credit had gone elsewhere, and by the time she was old enough to ask real questions, most of the men who'd built that suspension system by hand were already gone. Consider the actual sequence here. An American company designed a car for a market it barely understood. Australian engineers rescued that design under deadline, using knowledge Detroit hadn't provided and conditions Detroit hadn't anticipated. Detroit then absorbed that fix into its own global engineering practice, without crediting the country that solved it. Every step of that sequence happened quietly enough that most buyers, then and now, never learned any part of it at all. That's the real inheritance sitting underneath this car's badge. Not an American experiment wearing an Australian costume, and not a simple cover-up designed to hide foreign origins. Something closer to a genuine partnership nobody officially recognized. American ambition paired with Australian problem-solving, each side contributing something the other couldn't have managed alone, credited almost entirely to only one of them. Somewhere in a Melbourne garage, that same suspension geometry is still holding together on roads it was never meant to survive. Detroit built the blueprint. Australia built the reason it lasted. So which local car's real story haven't you heard yet? Name one below, and I'll dig into it next.